Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that floats through the darker corners of the Warhammer 40,000 lore community, one that does not get asked nearly as often as it deserves to be. When you think about the galaxy's most feared, most cruel, most terrifyingly dangerous species, the ones who raid whole planets for pleasure, who have turned pain into both a religion and a currency, who have spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of making other beings suffer in ways that make even the most brutal forces of chaos pause and take notice. You have to stop yourself eventually and wonder, with genuine intellectual curiosity, what does something like that actually worry about? What does a species that has mastered the art of inflicting horror, that has existed for over 10 millennia, specifically by feeding on the terror and anguish of everything else in the galaxy, actually feel afraid of? When the architects of suffering close their eyes in whatever passes for rest within their lightless, screaming city, what is it that waits for them in those quiet moments? The answer, as it turns out, is one of the most genuinely extraordinary things in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Because the Dark Eldar, properly called the Drukhari, are not just casually cruel. They are not villainous in the comfortable way that most fictional antagonists are villainous, twirling their proverbial moustaches while pursuing power for its own sake. They are something far more specific, far more layered. And when you start peeling back the surface of their razor-edged bravado and their terrible, blood-soaked aesthetic, what you find underneath is a story that is genuinely one of the most tragic and philosophically rich in this entire sprawling, grimdark universe. These creatures are afraid, deeply, constantly, existentially afraid. And understanding what they are afraid of and tracing the specific shape and texture of that fear through the architecture of their civilization is the key to understanding everything about them. It explains why they raid. It explains why they torture. It explains why their entire society is built around cruelty in a way that goes beyond mere preference or culture into something that looks uncomfortably like desperation. It explains the profound paradox that sits at the very heart of their existence. The fact that the thing keeping them alive is simultaneously destroying them, but has always been destroying them, and that they have known this for 10,000 years and cannot stop. So let's take our time with this. Let's settle into the darkness together and follow this story from its beginning. From the moment that an ancient and magnificent civilization made choices that would echo through every subsequent generation, down to the present moment of the 41st millennium, where the consequences of those choices are still playing out in the shadow streets of the most terrifying city in the galaxy. Because the fears of the Drukhari are not simple things, not one clear dread that can be named and contained. They are layered, one on top of the other, each one feeding into the next, while creating an interlocking system of dread that spans 10,000 years and reaches from the deepest personal terror to the widest existential horizon. We are going to go through all of them, every layer, and by the end, you will understand these creatures in a way that makes them considerably more interesting and considerably more disturbing than they were before. Let's start where all things start for the Drukhari, in ruin. Section 1. The Fall of the Eldari and the monster they made from themselves. To understand the fear, you must first understand the glory that preceded it, because the Drukhari's specific flavor of damnation is inseparable from the height from which they fell. Long before the Imperium of man raised its first banner across a cradle world called Terror, long before the great green tide of the Orcs began cutting its bloody path across the stars, long before even the stirring of the ancient Necron dynasties in their tomb silence, there was the Eldari Empire. And it was, by any measure you care to apply, genuinely magnificent in a way that the 41st millennium can barely remember. The Eldari were, put simply, everything a sentient civilization could aspire to become, and then considerably more. Their minds processed information at a speed and with a depth of complexity that made every other thinking species in the galaxy seem, by comparison, like they were working through honey. A human might think about a sunset and find it pleasant. An Eldari looking at the same sunset would experience something closer to a full sensory immersion in the physics of light and atmosphere. The mathematical beauty of the color spectrum, the emotional weight of transience, and the aesthetic pleasure of the whole composition simultaneously, all at an intensity that would likely overwhelm anyone who hadn't grown up with those senses. Their emotions ran correspondingly deep, not just more intense in volume, but more complex in character, capable of holding contradictory feelings simultaneously without collapsing into confusion, capable of experiencing grief and joy and wonder as distinct and layered experiences rather than simple binary states. And then there were their souls. The Eldari's psychic presence in the warp was not merely noticeable, it blazed. Each individual Eldari carried within them a spiritual signature of extraordinary magnitude and complexity, a bright light burning in the psychic ocean of the Imperium, with an intensity that made most other species look like candles next to bonfires. This was not just an abstract spiritual quality, it had practical consequences. The Eldari were among the most naturally powerful psykers in the galaxy, capable of abilities that other races could only achieve through years of training or dangerous pacts with warp entities. The strength of their souls was, for most of their history, simply one of the facts about them. A baseline, something unremarkable in itself because it had always been true. For a long stretch of galactic history, this combination of attributes made the Eldari genuinely unassailable. But their empire stretched across the galaxy in a network of worlds and webway routes, the webway being an interdimensional labyrinth of tunnels that ran between real space and the warp, allowing the Eldari to travel vast distances without ever exposing themselves to the dangers of open warp travel. Their military technology was centuries ahead of anything else in existence. Their understanding of the warp was sophisticated beyond measure. The ancient Necron dynasties had been defeated in the war in heaven and lay dormant beneath the ground of 1,000 tomb worlds. The Orc species was kept in check by Eldari patrols. Humanity was a young and scattered species, still developing its own empire during what would come to be called the Age of Technology. The Tyranid hive fleets were far out in the intergalactic dark, or unknown to any being in the Milky Way. The Eldari, by every metric that seemed to matter, stood at the absolute apex of the galaxy, and it is here, at the apex, that things began to go wrong in the slow, almost imperceptible way that catastrophic things often begin. When a civilization achieves a state in which there is no existential threat to sharpen its focus, no great enemy to define itself against, no limitation pressing against its ambitions, it tends to turn inward. The Eldari had reached a technological and cultural plateau at which labor was essentially obsolete. Sophisticated machine minds handled every practical necessity of existence. The Eldari were free, completely and absolutely free, to pursue whatever interested them. And for a species with senses as acute as theirs, art with emotional capacities as deep and complex as theirs, with creative and philosophical abilities that dwarfed those of any other race, what began to interest them was the exploration of experience itself. Sensation, feeling, the investigation of every possible mode of being pushed to its furthest limits. This would have been perhaps a philosophically interesting but ultimately sustainable period of exploration if it had remained balanced. If the Eldari had pursued sensation and experience with the same wisdom and perspective that had characterized their culture at its best. But balance is difficult to maintain when you have no obstacles, no consequences, no limiting factors. The descent into decadence was not a sudden collapse, but a slow slide spanning thousands of years, each step taking the culture a little further from the thoughtful, spiritually sophisticated civilization it had been towards something that prioritized intensity of experience above everything else. Pleasure cults rose throughout the empire, each one pushing against the limits of what was considered acceptable behavior, finding those limits, transgressing them, and then establishing the transgression as the new normal, while they looked for the next boundary to cross. The seers of the Eldari, their psychically gifted prophets and visionaries, watched what was happening in the warp with escalating horror. The Eldari's collective psychic output, the sum of billions of souls pursuing increasingly extreme pleasures and increasingly cruel entertainments, was accumulating in the Imperium. It was taking on shape. It was acquiring purpose and will. Something was growing in the psychic ocean, and the seers could see it clearly, even if they could not yet name it. They pleaded with their people to stop, to pull back, to remember what they had been before they had become this. They were ignored because the pull of sensation was stronger than the voice of caution, and the Eldari had been ignoring limits for so long that they had forgotten the limits were there for a reason. In the hidden subrealm of the webway that had become the city of Commorragh, the most extreme devotees of excess had found their sanctuary. The city had been established as a port in the webway centuries earlier, a node in the great network of interdimensional passages that connected the Eldari Empire. What made Commorragh unique was its location outside the formal jurisdiction of the Empire's governing councils, technically in a boundary space, autonomous in a way that the cities of the broader Empire were not. This autonomy attracted those who wanted to do things that would not have been tolerated in more regulated spaces. The pleasure cults that found their way to Commorragh were not the Empire's mainstream decadents. They were the extremists, even the declining Empire found troubling, the ones who had gone further and darker and stranger than anyone else, who had crossed the lines that made even the falling Empire uncomfortable. The things happening behind Commorragh's walls, in the deep history of the city before the fall, were remarkable in their horror, even by the standards of the culture that surrounded them. Cruelty, yes, but of a specifically artistic and deliberate kind. The refinement of pain as a philosophical and aesthetic pursuit. The development of techniques for extracting the maximum spiritual and emotional anguish from captives. The cultivation of suffering as a sensory experience to be savored, collected, categorized, and shared among connoisseurs. This was not random brutality. It was something more disturbing than that. It was brutality with methodology, with aesthetics, with pride of craft. And all of this fed the growing thing in the warp. For thousands of years, the accumulation continued. The psychic weight of Eldari excess pressed down on the Imperium from above. The growing entity pressed back up from below. The two forces met somewhere in the middle, and what happened at their meeting point was not a collision, but a birth. In what the Imperium would later date to the late 29th or early 30th millennium, Slaanesh achieved full consciousness and erupted into being. The birth of a chaos god is not a quiet event. It is an explosion of psychic energy on a scale that reshapes the galaxy. The souls of billions of Eldari, those in the heart of the Empire, those who had been feeding this thing for generations without knowing or caring what they were feeding, were ripped from their bodies in an instant and consumed. The warp tore open at the heart of the Eldari Empire, creating the vast scar in real space that the Imperium would come to call the Eye of Terror. The Eldari gods themselves, with the exception of 3 survivors, were slaughtered by this new thing they had inadvertently created. An empire that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years ceased to exist in the span of a single catastrophic moment. Those in the webway survived. The dimensional barriers of the webway shielded its inhabitants from the worst of the initial shockwave. Those in the subrealms and port cities of the webway, including the inhabitants of Commorragh, looked out at the ruins of their civilization and lived. What they did next is what defines the Drukhari and sets the foundation for every fear we are going to explore. They did not mourn. They did not reconsider. The pleasure cultists of Commorragh, the very faction that had most vigorously pursued the excesses that fed Slaanesh into existence, that had contributed more directly to the birth of the Chaos God than almost any other group in the Empire. It did not look at the death of their civilization and feel horror at what they had helped to cause. Instead, they discovered that Slaanesh was still coming for them. The The dimensional protection of the webway was real but not absolute. The souls of the Drukhari were still slowly draining away, leaching out of them into the warp, drawn toward the thing that waited there with perfect patience and infinite hunger. And they discovered, through necessity and experimentation, that when they caused suffering in others, when they inflicted pain and drank in the psychic resonance of that suffering, the draining slowed. The hunger inside them was temporarily filled by borrowed essence. The pull of Slaanesh eased, just enough, just long enough to make continuing possible. This discovery was the birth of what the Drukhari would become. Not an act of repentance, not a decision to build something better from the ruins of what the Eldari had destroyed. Rather, the convenient discovery that survival itself required them to continue doing the things they had always preferred to do. The galaxy's most enthusiastically monstrous species had been given permission by their own biology and their own spiritual condition to be exactly as monstrous as they wanted to be. And that convenient alignment, that arrangement in which their deepest and most destructive appetites were simultaneously the mechanism of their survival, is the original and fundamental fear that underlies every other fear we are going to explore in this video. Because if survival requires you to be monstrous, and you are also naturally inclined toward monstrousness, you never have to confront the question of whether you could have chosen differently. The necessity is the story the Drukhari tell themselves. And the thing they are most afraid of, at the deepest level, is the possibility that the necessity is not as absolute as they need it to be. Section 2. She who thirsts, the eternal enemy who cannot be opposed. Now we need to spend serious time with Slaanesh, because you cannot approach the fear architecture of the Drukhari without a clear understanding of what Slaanesh actually is in relation to them. This is not a simple predator-prey relationship. It is something stranger, more intimate, and considerably more horrifying than that. Most factions in the 41st millennium experience the Chaos Gods as external threats, forces of incomprehensible power that exist on the other side of reality, or that can be reached through warp travel or psychic practice, that can be resisted or appeased, or bargained with, or simply feared from a distance. The relationship between Slaanesh and the Eldari, and by extension the Drukhari, is nothing like this comfortable distance. Slaanesh was not some ancient entity that turned its attention to the Eldari. Slaanesh was grown from the Eldari themselves. The Chaos God of pleasure and excess is, in the most literal psycho-spiritual sense available in this setting, a product of what the Eldari were. A dark reflection given will and hunger. A worst impulse made divine. A monster that calls them kin, and that call is not metaphorical. Because of this origin, Slaanesh has a claim on every Eldari soul that is unlike any claim the Chaos Gods hold over other species. Which when a human being dies without the Emperor's protection, their soul faces the dangers of the warp, chaos entities and predators, and the general hostility of an environment that is, by its nature, not kind to the recently deceased. But the connection between that human soul and any specific Chaos God is contingent, dependent on choices made during life, corruption pursued or avoided, specific allegiances formed or forsworn. There is no inherent bond between a human soul and Tzeentch or Nurgle or Khorne. The bond must be created. Between Slaanesh and the Eldari, the bond exists without any choices being made. It was inscribed in the moment of Slaanesh's birth, or when the Chaos God erupted into being from the accumulated psychic weight of Eldari excess, and immediately recognized in every remaining Eldari the species whose essence had created it, the creatures who were, in a fundamental sense, its parents and its food simultaneously. Slaanesh hungers for Eldari souls specifically and personally because it was built from those souls, and those souls were the first thing it ever consumed. The Craftworld Eldari understood this immediately and built their entire culture around managing it. The Spirit Stones, worn by every Craftworld Eldari, are not jewelry. They are life insurance of a very specific kind. Psychocrystalline devices calibrated to capture an Eldari soul at the exact moment of death, trapping it before it can begin its journey into the warp, and therefore is before Slaanesh can claim it. The infinity circuits of the craft worlds serve as communal afterlives, vast networks of crystalline matrices within the ship itself that hold the souls of the dead in a state of preserved consciousness, safe from she who thirsts. The craft world. Eldari have turned the management of this threat into the defining principle of their culture. Everything they do, the strict path system, the emotional discipline, the communal spiritual practices, exists in service of keeping Slaanesh's attention and appetite directed away from them. The Drukhari have none of this. No spirit stones, no infinity circuits, no philosophical framework for keeping their psychic profile small and their connection to the warp minimal. What they have is the webway, which offers some protection by placing them within a dimensional space that is not directly the warp, and the discovery that feeding on suffering provides temporary spiritual sustenance. And the specific horror of the Drukhari's relationship with Slaanesh is that it is not even waiting for them to die. Slaanesh is consuming the Drukhari while they are still alive, slowly, continuously, as a constant background process that never stops. The souls of the Drukhari are being drained even as their hearts beat and their lungs breathe and their minds scheme and desire and hunger. Every day that passes, Slaanesh takes a little more. The accumulation of this theft is visible. A Drukhari who has not fed on the suffering of others for any extended period begins to show it physically. The skin stretches and grows pallid, almost translucent. The eyes grow flat and dull, losing the predatory brightness that characterizes the Drukhari at their most vital. The body begins to age with cruel speed, the biological damage of time that should be reversed by the consumption of soul essence instead, accumulating unchecked. A Drukhari going through withdrawal from this spiritual sustenance looks, progressively, like something that is dying from the inside out, because that is exactly what is happening. And if they die? If a Drukhari falls in battle, or is killed by a rival in Commorragh, or dies for any of the 1,000 reasons that death finds sentient beings, their soul goes to Slaanesh, not to some generalized afterlife with associated risks, directly, immediately, completely to the Dark Prince. An eternity of torment in the most elaborately unpleasant divine realm in the setting, are devoured and processed through whatever the chaos god of excess inflicts on the souls it consumes. The lore is not specific about what this experience entails, but the fact that the Drukhari fear it more than almost anything else in the universe tells you as much as you need to know about what they imagine it to be. There is no good death for a Drukhari. There is no peaceful ending available to them. There is only the choice between a gradual, painful diminishment of the soul during life, mitigated by feeding on others but never fully stopped, and the sudden and final consumption of that soul at the moment of death. The Drukhari exist in a state of perpetual spiritual emergency, fighting off one form of annihilation with actions that guarantee another form of annihilation if they are ever stopped. This is the first and most fundamental fear, and it is not a fear that can be conquered by intelligence or courage or political maneuvering. It is an existential condition, woven into the fabric of what the Drukhari are, and cannot be unwoven without fundamentally changing what they are. A human being might be afraid of death in a general sense, might fear pain or loss or the unknown, but these fears have some possibility of resolution, some way in which circumstances might improve. The Drukhari's fear of Slaanesh has none of these qualities. It is as permanent and inescapable as gravity. What makes it especially worth sitting with is the irony embedded in their response to this fear. But the feeding on suffering that keeps them going, the raiding and the torture and the arena spectacles and all the machinery of Commorragh's pain economy, ultimately produces exactly the thing that Slaanesh wants. The suffering of sentient beings, concentrated and refined, and fed into the Drukhari's sustenance system, produces a vast and continuous outpouring of psychic pain energy that resonates through the warp in precisely the frequencies that the Dark Prince finds most nourishing. The Drukhari are running an engine that feeds both themselves and their enemy. The machine they have built to survive the predation of Slaanesh is simultaneously one of the most efficient mechanisms for feeding that predation that could be imagined. Some of the oldest and most self-reflective among the Drukhari have understood this. The Haemonkuli are those ancient flesh sculptors who have had millennia to think about the nature of their existence while their hands worked in their torture workshops, have arrived at conclusions about the nature of the arrangement that they tend not to share widely, because sharing widely would be dangerous. Not because the information is secret, but because an idea that undermines the entire justification for the Drukhari way of life is an idea that Asdrubal Vect would consider threatening to social stability, and what Vect considers threatening tends not to last long in Commorragh. The fear of Slaanesh, then, is not simply a fear of a powerful entity. It is the fear of one's own complicity in one's own damnation. It is the fear that looks like cruelty from the outside but is, from the inside, something more like desperation wearing cruelty's face. And the Drukhari know, those of them who allow themselves to know anything honestly, that they are not outwitting the Dark Prince. They are dancing to music she who thirsts wrote, and the music has been playing for 10,000 years. There is also the specific mechanics of what Slaanesh's consumption actually does to a Drukhari soul that has been taken rather than drained. The lore contains references to soul-eaten Drukhari, beings from whom Slaanesh's slow theft has taken so much that they have become hollow, wandering shells. These are not the dramatic deaths of warriors consumed in full by the Chaos God. They are what happens when the slow drain has gone on long enough, through neglect of the feeding cycle or simple bad fortune, that the essential self has been taken piece by piece without the final death that would complete the transaction. These husks wander Commorragh streets, performing the motions of their former lives, visiting familiar locations, repeating familiar gestures, while whatever looked out through their eyes, whatever made them a particular individual rather than a biological machine, is gone, consumed in installments. And every Drukhari who walks past one of these wandering things knows, with a clarity that no amount of sensory indulgence can fully blot out, that this is one of the available futures. This is where the cycle leads, eventually, for everyone who runs it long enough. Section 3. The Thirst. A hunger that will never let you rest. Let us spend more time with what the Drukhari themselves call the thirst, because it is not merely a metaphor or a philosophical concept. It is a biological and spiritual reality that shapes every single decision every Drukhari makes from the moment they first become aware of it, which happens in the earliest days of their maturity, until the moment they die. Understanding the thirst is understanding why the Drukhari are what they are in the most practical, ground-level sense. The mechanism works like this. As the Drukhari move through their lives, navigating Commorragh's political currents, raiding other species, attending the arena spectacles of the witch cults, going about whatever passes for daily life in the Dark City, Slaanesh is continuously and gradually pulling at their soul essence, not in great violent gulps, most of the time, in a slow, constant, irresistible draw, like water, draining through a very small hole. The Drukhari can feel this happening. It is experienced as a gnawing emptiness, a growing hollowness at the center of the self, a deepening ache that intensifies by the day. They call it the thirst, and the name is accurate in the most visceral sense. It is felt as a desperate need, as urgent and physical as actual dehydration, impossible to ignore, impossible to reason away. It does not respond to willpower or philosophy. It responds only to feeding. When a Drukhari inflicts pain on a sufficiently self-aware being, when they cause the kind of intense, concentrated, specific anguish that sentient creatures alone can produce. They draw in the psychic resonance of that suffering. The victim's terror and pain radiate outward into the warp as a detectable form of spiritual energy. And the Drukhari's own psychic nature absorbs this energy, using it to replenish the soul essence that Slaanesh has been taking. The hollow is temporarily filled, the ache subsides, and physically, visibly, the Drukhari is transformed. A Drukhari who looked drawn and ancient and hollow 30 minutes ago can look youthful and vital and sharp after feeding. The biological signs of Slaanesh's theft reversed by the intake of stolen spiritual sustenance. But the thirst returns. It always returns. The filling is temporary, the draining is permanent, and the only way to maintain the balance is to keep feeding, continuously, indefinitely. This is not a condition that can be resolved. There is no cure. There is no amount of feeding sufficient to permanently satisfy the thirst, and no store of accumulated soul essence that can be built up against future need, no spiritual technology that can simply turn off the drain. The Drukhari are running on a treadmill that never stops moving, and the speed of the treadmill increases as they age, as their souls have less left to lose, and the balance between sustenance and depletion becomes progressively more precarious. This is why raiding is not optional. This is a point that casual observers of the Drukhari sometimes miss, reading the raids as an expression of cultural preference or military expansionism, when they are something much more fundamental. The constant raids that the Dark Eldar launch against worlds across the galaxy, the kidnapping operations, the slaving runs, the attacks on Imperial convoys and Tau settlements and everything else that has enough sentient life to be worth the effort, are not primarily about conquest or expansion or wealth accumulation in any conventional sense. They are about feeding. They are as necessary to Drukhari survival as food and water are to human survival. And the Drukhari who fails to raid, who runs out of victims, who cannot access the psychic sustenance they need, dies. Not metaphorically. Literally, physically, visibly dies. Withering and aging with terrible speed, their soul consumed by the debt they cannot pay, their body following shortly after. The witch cults that maintain Commorragh's great arenas exist in service of this need on a mass scale, as the nightly performances of combat and death and pain that fill those vast spectator spaces are not simply entertainment, though the Drukhari do genuinely enjoy them as such. They are a public feeding mechanism. The psychic resonance of the suffering displayed in the arenas radiates outward into the crowd, providing at least some degree of sustenance to the watching masses, keeping the population stable enough to function without turning on each other quite as dramatically as they otherwise might. The arenas are managed feeding troughs, and the crowds who fill them every night are there partly because they need what the arenas provide, and partly because they genuinely prefer to get that sustenance from watching rather than having to hunt for it themselves. Even watching two large creatures fight in the streets of Commorragh is enough to provide some small measure of sustenance. According to the law, the suffering and violence and high-stakes conflict of any sufficiently intense event produces the psychic resonance the Drukhari need, however weakly. The city's culture of casual, omnipresent violence is not incidental to its spiritual economy. It is integral to it. Every act of cruelty performed within Commorragh's walls contributes, however slightly, to the psychic atmosphere of pain and suffering that keeps the city's population functioning. The thirst creates several deeply interesting secondary effects on Drukhari culture and psychology that are worth sitting with. First, it creates an absolute dependency on the continued availability of prey, of sentient beings capable of suffering in the specific, resonant way the Drukhari need. This creates an existential stake in the continued existence and availability of prey species that is, paradoxically, one of the few things that keeps the Drukhari from being more destructive than they actually are. They cannot afford to exterminate their food sources. They need a galaxy full of sentient, suffering beings, and so they practice a very specific kind of restraint, one that has nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with resource management. Second, the thirst creates an economy. In Commorragh, slaves are currency in the most literal sense, not merely because they can be traded for other goods, but because they represent portable, storable units of spiritual sustenance. A slave in Commorragh is literally a living battery, their potential suffering a resource to be hoarded or spent. When an archon pays a homunculus for services with a shipment of slaves, that is not just a labor exchange. It is a spiritual transaction, the transfer of feeding potential. Third, and perhaps most interesting in terms of what it reveals about the Drukhari's psychology, the thirst creates a very specific kind of relationship between the Drukhari and the beings they prey upon. For most predators, the prey is an obstacle between the predator and nutrition, something to be overcome as efficiently as possible. The Drukhari's relationship with their prey is fundamentally different. The suffering they need is not incidental to the prey's experience. It is the point, which means the Drukhari need their victims to be conscious, aware, and capable of experiencing what is happening to them. They need them to understand at some level what is being done to them. The prey's consciousness is not a complication, it is the ingredient. This creates the dark inverse of empathy, an attunement to the inner states of victims that is, in its technical functioning, nearly identical to compassion, but pointed in the opposite direction. The most skilled torturers in Commorragh's tradition are skilled precisely because they can read what a victim is feeling with extraordinary accuracy, can track the emotional and psychological state of a person being broken in real time, can tell the difference between suffering that is producing the rich, the resonant anguish they need, and suffering that has collapsed into numbness or dissociation that is feeding them poorly. This expertise is not cruelty in the simple sense of not caring. It is a terrible form of caring, a professional and practiced attentiveness to the inner life of another being that exists entirely in service of their consumption. The homunculi have elevated this to something approaching a philosophy. They do not simply hurt. They study the architecture of suffering the way an engineer studies stress points in a material, understanding how much pressure, applied where, produces what specific response, and how to extend the period of productive anguish before the breaking point that ends usefulness. There are schools within the homunculus covens that have developed distinct theoretical frameworks about the nature of pain, about which species suffer in qualitatively different ways and why, about the relationship between psychological anticipation and physical sensation in maximizing what they call yield. It is, in its own deeply disturbing way, a field of genuine inquiry, and the thirst is what drives it. The biological and spiritual necessity of feeding that has been elevated over 10,000 years of extremely motivated practice into something that now functions as its own end. Third, and perhaps most darkly, the thirst makes the Drukhari extraordinarily skilled at calibrating and extending suffering. They have had 10,000 years to learn exactly how much pain a given species can be made to feel. What kinds of experience produce the richest psychic resonance, how to extend the suffering of a captive to maximize the yield before the captive is exhausted. Their expertise in torture is not purely sadistic, though it is certainly that. It is also professional, a developed technical competency refined over millennia to serve a specific functional need. The homunculi are the masters of this field, but even ordinary Kabbalite warriors learn the basics as part of their military training. Weapons designed to maim rather than kill, to keep victims alive and suffering rather than swiftly ending them. This is not a philosophical choice about the value of life. It is an agricultural practice. What makes the thirst a form of fear specifically, rather than just an inconvenient biological condition, is the dimension of control, or rather, is the complete absence of it. The Drukhari are driven by the thirst in ways they cannot override with willpower or intelligence. An Eldari of the craft worlds might feel the pull of strong emotion and choose to discipline it through their path practice. A Drukhari, experiencing the intensifying hunger of a deepening thirst, has no such option available to them. The need operates below the level of conscious decision-making, and refusing it is not a matter of strength of character. It is simply not possible. The thirst will be fed, one way or another. The only question is when and how. This is what makes it fear, and not merely need. The Drukhari are afraid of the thirst in the way that those in the grip of powerful compulsions are sometimes afraid of their own inability to resist them, not the external trigger, but the fact of their own unfreedom. Their nature drives them toward behavior that keeps them alive, yes, but also behavior that makes them exactly the thing they might not want to be if they ever allowed themselves the luxury of honestly examining who they are. The thirst is the mechanism that prevents that honest examination, that keeps the question of choice from ever being clearly confronted. And the awareness of this, in those rare moments when it becomes visible, is one of the most uncomfortable things in the Drukhari experience. Section 4. The Forbidden Art. Why the Drukhari banned their own power. Here is a piece of information that stops most newcomers to Warhammer 40,000 lore short when they first encounter it. The Drukhari are descended from the Eldari, a species that is, as a whole, among the most powerful naturally psychic civilizations in the galaxy's current epoch. Craftworld Eldari farseers can see decades or centuries into the future, reading the threads of possibility in the warp with a clarity that no human psyker could hope to match. Warlocks project devastating storms of focused psychic energy, powerful enough to tear through power-armored space marines. Psykers among the Eldari are not rare anomalies requiring careful management, the way they are among humanity. They are a natural and integral expression of what the species is, woven into the fabric of Eldari culture and warfare at every level. The Drukhari have almost no psykers at all, and this absence is not an accident of evolution. It is a deliberate policy that has been enforced in various forms for 10,000 years. The psychic abilities that come naturally to Eldari have been suppressed within the Drukhari so thoroughly over so many generations that their latent potential has genuinely atrophied. The power is still there, buried deep in the neurological and spiritual heritage that they share with their craftworld cousins. But the active expression of it has been systematically bred and, in the most literal sense, executed out of the population. The reason for this is one of their deepest and most persistent fears, and it is a fear that reveals something essential about the specific shape of their vulnerability. Using psychic power requires opening a channel to the Imperium.
Okay, I just want to pause here for a second and be honest with you, because I think this is the part of the Dark Eldar lore that genuinely got me. Like, when I first started reading into this stuff, and I mean really reading, not just looking at the army aesthetic and thinking, cool spiky elves, this is the section that made me put the book down for a minute, because it stopped being a fictional alien species and started being something that felt weirdly recognizable. The idea of a civilization that keeps moving, keeps consuming, keeps making noise specifically because it is terrified of what the silence would say, that's not just a Warhammer thing. I find that genuinely uncomfortable in the most interesting way possible. And I think that is why I keep coming back to this faction above almost any other in 40k. Not because they're the coolest on the table, though they are, but because the lore underneath them is doing something that most grimdark fiction does not bother to do. It is asking a real question. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Every psyker, when they reach through the warp to grasp the energies that fuel their abilities, which creates a connection between their mind and the psychic ocean that underlies reality. This connection is, of necessity, two-directional. The energies flow in, the psyker uses them, and in the process, the psyker becomes visible within the warp, a bright point of psychic activity that can be detected by any entity attuned to such things. For most species, this visibility is a calculated risk, managed through training and equipment and the development of psychic disciplines designed to minimize the danger. It is dangerous but manageable. For the Drukhari, this calculation is completely different. Their souls are already marked by Slaanesh, already being slowly consumed, already under a claim that has been running continuously since the fall of the Eldari. The attention of She Who Thirsts is already on them, in the background, perpetually. A Drukhari using psychic power would not simply be visible in the warp, in the general sense that all psychers are visible. They would be actively broadcasting their presence to the one entity in the entire universe that has the most personal and pressing interest in them, in a way that would be roughly equivalent to shining a searchlight directly into the face of a predator that is already watching you from the shadows. It would invite an escalation of attention that the Drukhari cannot afford, from a source that already wants them more than they can safely permit. And critically, the risk is not just to the individual psyker. The webway within which Commorragh sits is not infinitely protected from the energies of the warp. Strong enough psychic activity within the city can create instabilities in the dimensional barriers that keep the warp from bleeding through, can crack the walls between Commorragh and the outer Imperium in ways that invite exactly the kind of catastrophic warp incursion known as a disjunction. A single uncontrolled psyker in Commorragh is not just a personal danger. It is a potential trigger for a city-wide catastrophe that could kill millions and permanently damage sections of the city itself. The stakes are not individual. They are civilizational. So psychic power is banned in Commorragh, not regulated, not monitored, not carefully permitted under specific circumstances with appropriate oversight. Banned as one of the very few absolute laws in a society that otherwise celebrates the transgression of virtually every conceivable limit. The use of psychic abilities is one of the few things expressly forbidden even to visitors. The discovery of a functioning psyker within Commorragh is treated as an emergency rather than a finding, as Drubal Vect himself enforced this prohibition with characteristic thoroughness. Records suggest that his command resulted in the systematic identification and execution of psychically gifted Drukhari over the centuries, a deliberate program of genetic culling designed to reduce the species' active psychic potential to as close to zero as achievable. The result is that over 10 millennia of deliberate suppression, yet the Drukhari's psychic abilities have atrophied to a degree that goes beyond cultural repression into something more fundamental. This lack of psychic presence has an interesting tactical consequence worth noting. Craftworld farseers use the warp to see futures, to detect threats and plan against them. An approaching fleet of Drukhari, with their minimal psychic signatures, can sometimes pass undetected through the warp reading of their opponents until they are already through a webway portal and screaming through the atmosphere of their target world. The fear that drove the suppression of their power has, over enough time, become a tactical advantage. But it is an advantage bought at the cost of something fundamental, an adaptation born of terror that has become a feature, but a feature that cannot obscure what it replaced. So there is also a secondary consequence of the psychic ban that reveals a particular and uncomfortable irony. The Drukhari suppress their psychic abilities specifically because using them would draw Slaanesh's attention. But Slaanesh's attention is already on them. The drain is already happening. The claim is already active. The suppression is not actually reducing the fundamental spiritual debt. It is reducing the risk of that debt being called in more dramatically, more suddenly, more completely. It is not prevention, it is harm reduction. And the Drukhari who allow themselves to think about this distinction too clearly tend to find the realizations that follow somewhat difficult to sit with. Check Section 5. Commorragh. A city sustained by the fear. It generates. Commorragh is one of the most extraordinary locations in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. And the more you understand about how it functions and what keeps it together, the more remarkable and the more terrible it becomes. On the surface, it is the ultimate expression of Drukhari power, their stronghold, their home, the place from which all raids are launched and to which all trophies and slaves are returned. Its scale is essentially impossible to fully comprehend in conventional terms. The city exists within the webway in a series of interconnected subrealms that have been expanding for 10,000 years, consuming and absorbing other pocket dimensions, private estates of ancient Eldari lords, independent port cities, and entire collapsed sections of the former Eldari webway network. Its total size exceeds that of many star systems in real space. It is powered by the Ilmia, stolen suns, actual stars ripped from their home systems in real space and transported into the webway to burn above Commorragh's spires, providing the city with essentially unlimited energy while leaving behind frozen, dead solar systems from which they were taken. This level of audacity, of casual galactic appropriation, tells you something important about the scale at which the Drukhari are willing to operate. But underneath the image of invulnerable, terrible grandeur, Commorragh is a city that lives in constant fear of itself and of the things pressing against it from all sides. And understanding the specific structure of that fear tells you as much about what the Drukhari are as anything else in their lore. The primary, ever-present fear within Commorragh is the disjunction, the rupture of the barriers between the webway and the outer warp, through which chaos demons pour into the city. We will spend dedicated time on the most serious disjunction in Commorragh's recent history later in this script, but it is important to understand it now as a background condition of life in the city, not just as a specific historical event. Every Drukhari in Commorragh lives with the background awareness that their city might crack open at any time, that the dimensional barriers between their home and the nightmare waiting outside might fail today, or tomorrow, or without warning sufficient to meaningfully prepare. As the disjunction is not a theoretical future threat, it is a recognized, documented historical event that has happened before. Smaller disjunctions have occurred throughout Commorragh's history, contained and managed at enormous cost, and will almost certainly happen again. The specific forces most likely to pour through are, of course, the servants of Slaanesh, drawn by the irresistible psychic signature of a city full of the exact souls she who thirsts most covets. Deep within the older sections of Commorragh, there is a specific location known as Cain's Gate, an ancient sealed portal in the webway, one of the oldest features of the city that has existed since before the fall. On the other side of Cain's Gate, pressing against it with increasing intensity over the millennia, are the demon forces of Slaanesh. The gate's seals are maintained by some of the most sophisticated dimensional engineering the Drukhari possess, reinforced over thousands of years, a technical achievement of extraordinary complexity and cost. But the seals are not infinite. The pressure from the other side is constant, and it is growing. Asdrubal Vect was apparently aware of this danger long enough in advance to cede the territory surrounding the gate to his rivals, ensuring that when the problem became acute, it would be his enemies rather than his allies who absorbed the worst of it. Beyond the fear of disjunction, Commorragh's internal fears are structural in a way that makes the city itself a kind of engine of dread. And the social structure is a meritocracy of violence in the most literal possible sense. Advancement requires the demonstrated ability to dominate and destroy others, and the failure to maintain this demonstration is an invitation for rivals to move against you. This is not metaphorical. In Commorragh, the moment you appear vulnerable, in the most direct sense, you are advertising to everyone around you that you are worth attacking. The moment your defenses seem thin, that your alliances seem shaky, that your power seems less than absolute, you will be tested. This creates a city-wide atmosphere that is, at its structural core, driven by fear. Every Archon and their household is afraid of the Archons above them in the power hierarchy, and simultaneously working to manage the fear and resentment of those below. Every Kabbalite warrior is afraid of their superiors, afraid of rival cabals, afraid of the homunculi in the lower districts, whose good graces might mean the difference between resurrection and true death when they fall in battle. Even the witch cults, those apparently free-spirited bands of gladiatorial warriors who present the most visibly confident face in Commorragh, operate within webs of obligation and protection that are sustained by exactly the same currency of threatened violence as everything else in the city. The homunculi occupy a particularly interesting position in Commorragh's ecology of fear. These ancient, twisted flesh sculptors have lived within the depths of the city for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, perfecting their arts in the laboratory oubliettes of the underspires. They are effectively impossible to permanently kill, having developed the ability to leave preserved soul essences in extra-dimensional caskets, so that even total physical destruction merely means a temporary inconvenience followed by resurrection in new flesh. The only way to truly and permanently end a homunculus is the simultaneous destruction of both physical form and soul casket, which requires extraordinary preparation and timing. They have accumulated knowledge and power across millennia that the younger generation of Drukhari cannot match or fully understand, and they provide the service that every Drukhari of any consequence desperately wants: resurrection after death. Because of this, the homunculi are simultaneously servitors and tyrants. Every Drukhari who enters into a pact with a homunculus, trading slaves or favors or promises of future services for the right to be brought back from death, places themselves in a relationship of profound dependency with a being that is ancient, unpredictable, and operates according to aesthetic and philosophical principles that are not always legible from outside their craft. The homunculi reshape flesh as art. They have opinions about what forms are interesting. A Drukhari who offends their homunculus patron might be resurrected perfectly, or they might be resurrected in a form that reflects the homunculus's current aesthetic interests, which may or may not align with what the revived Drukhari would have chosen. Even other Drukhari secretly fear the homunculi, despite their dependency on them. An entity that can reshape not just your body but potentially your soul, that has lived long enough to develop agendas that span centuries, and that operates according to a personal philosophy too alien for most Drukhari to fully comprehend, is not something you want angry at you. The underspires of Commorragh are not places that the rest of the city's population visits casually. They go when they need to, and they leave as quickly as possible, and they do their best not to attract attention beyond what is necessary for their specific transaction. Section 6. Asdrubal. Vect, the dread that devours even nightmares. There is one entity in Commorragh's hierarchy of terror that stands so comprehensively above all others that discussing the city's fears without dedicating serious attention to him would be like describing the climate of a world without mentioning its star. Asdrubal Vect, supreme overlord of the Dark City, Archon of the Cabal of the Black Heart, the being who rose from literal slavery, the absolute lowest position in a society that weaponizes social status in the most direct possible ways, to become the undisputed master of the most dangerous civilization in the known galaxy, and has held that mastery for over 10,000 years. Vect was born a slave in Commorragh. This is not a rhetorical device or a legend he cultivated about himself. It is apparently factual, and the specific humiliation of that origin, being the property of the very aristocracy he would later destroy, is something that has clearly shaped everything he subsequently became. He emerged from slavery through a combination of extraordinary intelligence and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary. He carved a path through Commorragh's violent social landscape, and eventually founded the Cabal of the Black Heart, the first organization in Commorragh's history to openly call itself by what Vect coined as the name Eladrith Ineus, Dark Eldar. When Vect began his rise to supreme power, Commorragh was ruled by the ancient noble houses, families whose authority dated back to before the fall of the Eldari, who had maintained their position across 10,000 years through accumulated wealth, military strength, and the specific social authority that came from being able to claim direct descent from the old empire's aristocracy. These houses were formidable. They were also, as Vect identified with exceptional clarity, unable to be overcome through direct confrontation. Yet he was a slave-born street fighter with a newly founded cabal, and none of the inherited legitimacy the noble houses possessed. Fighting them head-on was not a viable option, so he did not fight them directly. What he did was engineer a situation in which someone else destroyed them for him. He arranged the capture of a Salamander Space Marine strike cruiser, the Forgehammer, and had it brought through a webway portal into Commorragh. His rivals, seeing this prize, rushed to claim the contents. And the Salamander's chapter, receiving the psychic distress call of their trapped librarian and using it to locate Commorragh within the webway, launched a full assault that brought Space Marine forces directly into the heart of the Dark City. The noble houses were caught in the middle of an incursion they had not anticipated and were not positioned to handle elegantly, were devastated. When the Marines eventually withdrew, the great houses of Commorragh were broken, and Vect emerged as the city's undisputed ruler. The willingness to invite Space Marines into Commorragh, to allow the one place the Drukhari considered absolutely safe from outside attack to be violated, to accept significant destruction and loss of life as acceptable cost for achieving his political aims, tells you everything essential about how Vect thinks. Nothing is too precious to be used. No cost is too high if the outcome is sufficient. And patience is not a virtue for him. It is a weapon, and he wields it across timescales that make the most long-lived of his rivals look short-sighted. What in the 10,000 years since his ascension, Vect has maintained absolute power in the most violently unstable society imaginable through a combination of intelligence so vast and comprehensive that it approaches something like prescience, manipulation so sophisticated that his enemies frequently find themselves executing his plans without realizing it, and an absolute willingness to treat every person and institution in his city as a potential tool. His rivals have, on multiple occasions, discovered that their most carefully laid schemes against him were enabled by him, that the intelligence leaks, the opportunities, the apparent windows of vulnerability they thought they were exploiting were windows he had opened deliberately, leading them exactly where he wanted them to be. He uses doppelgangers, the geldling, a mysterious double. He serves as his substitute on occasions when Vect chooses not to be physically present while still needing to be represented. He feigns death strategically when the political landscape requires that his enemies believe him gone so that they reveal their true positions. He has survived multiple assassination attempts, multiple political crises, multiple challenges from rivals who thought they had finally found the moment. And in every case, the challenger ended up serving Vect's longer-term goals through the very act of opposing him. The fear he generates in Commorragh is qualitatively different from anything else the city produces. Most powerful figures are feared because of demonstrated capacity for violence, the accumulated weight of their history, their reputation for cruelty. Vect generates fear because no one can be certain what he actually wants, whether any given event is being orchestrated by him, or whether any given opposition to his interests is playing directly into his hands. The uncertainty is paralyzing in a way that raw power alone could never achieve. And in a society where failure means death in a variety of specifically unpleasant forms, that uncertainty is sufficient to prevent most of his potential rivals from ever moving against him decisively. What does Vect himself fear? He fears unpredictability. He fears the kind of events that operate outside the established patterns he has spent 10,000 years learning to read and manipulate. The birth of Yvraine, the partial awakening of Ynnari, the coming of the Great Rift. These were events that introduced variables he had not fully incorporated into his models, forces that operated according to logics that his extraordinary intelligence could not entirely predict or preempt. For the first time in his extraordinarily long existence, Vect found himself reacting to events rather than orchestrating them. For a being whose power rests entirely on the perception and reality of total control, the appearance of vulnerability, even temporary, even subsequently managed, is catastrophic in its own specific way. It is the one thing he has not fully insulated himself from. the possibility that the galaxy will eventually produce something his intellect cannot account for in advance. As Section 7, the architecture of paranoia, what daily fear looks like from inside. Before we get to the specific catastrophic events that have most dramatically tested the Drukhari's capacity to survive their own fears, it is worth pausing to consider what the daily texture of existence in Commorragh actually feels like when you know everything we have covered so far. Because the fears we have been talking about are not abstract, are not the exclusive concern of scholars or leaders or philosophers. They are present in various forms in the experience of every single being who walks the streets of the Dark City. Consider the ordinary Kabbalite warrior, not an archon or a homunculus, not some ancient or powerful figure, but the rank-and-file soldier of one of Commorragh's countless cabals, living in the mid-tier districts where the spires are still maintained but the lighting is unreliable, and the difference between a quiet night and one punctuated by violence is always a matter of political accidents beyond their control. This person wakes each day into an environment that is simultaneously their home and one of the most consistently dangerous locations in the known galaxy. They are subject to the thirst, which means that the baseline texture of their daily existence includes a low-grade ache that intensifies if they go without sufficient contact with pain and suffering for more than a few days. They are subject to their Archon's authority, which means that their survival depends on navigating the political currents of their cabal with enough skill to be useful, but not enough ambition to appear threatening. They are subject to rival cabals, whose warriors they might encounter on any street corner, and who might be calculating at any given moment whether the political cost of attacking them is worth the potential gain. And they are subject to the background awareness that the walls of their city might crack open, and that the thing which has been draining them their entire life has been pressing against those walls for as long as Commorragh has existed. This is not a life in which any given moment can be fully relaxed. There is no safe space in Commorragh, not really. Even the most powerful Archon's personal chambers are protected only by the loyalty of guards, whose loyalty is itself a calculated position, by the architectural defenses of a building that could be compromised, by the continued favor of Vect's politics, and by all the same contingencies that make everything else in Commorragh provisional. The strongest person in the city, short of Vect himself, is still not truly safe. And the ordinary Kabbalite warrior is not the strongest person in the city. What this produces, across a population of millions living in these conditions for generations spanning millennia, is a specific psychological character that the Drukhari wear so naturally, they likely no longer recognize it as a response to conditions rather than simply the shape of existence. It is a hyper-alertness that never fully disengages, a constant peripheral awareness of exits, allies, enemies, potential threats, the angle of a stranger's posture, the quality of silence in a place that was recently noisy. It is the absolute inability to trust without simultaneous reserve, and the habit of presenting a performed version of oneself to every social interaction while maintaining the real version behind it as a backup. It is the capacity for pleasure in violence that is, at some level, an expression of relief. The relief of being the one causing harm rather than experiencing it, however briefly, in a city where the distinction is always available to change. The performances they maintain are themselves a kind of fear management. The extreme aesthetic of Drukhari clothing and body modification, the blades worked into garments, the modification of their bodies into weapons and statements simultaneously, the cultivation of an appearance designed to broadcast threat in every detail. This is not vanity in any simple sense. It is deterrence, as it is the continuous advertisement that attacking this particular individual would be costly, that they are formidable, that they are not worth the trouble. In a society where the perception of weakness is an invitation to predation, the maintenance of the appearance of strength is not optional. It is survival. The Drukhari aesthetic is, at its most fundamental, a fear response to living in a place that will absolutely exploit any perceived opening. And yet, And this is perhaps the most genuinely human thing about them. They have made this necessity into something they genuinely love. The aesthetic is real, the pride in it is real, the genuine pleasure they take in the craftsmanship of their violence and the elegance of their cruelty, while rooted in conditions of profound fear. It has become an authentic expression of who they are, rather than merely a survival mechanism. They are not pretending to love the beauty of their terrible city and the elaborate performances of power that fill it. They genuinely do. The love grew out of the fear, the way a pearl grows out of an irritant. The original cause is something you would not have chosen, but the result is something you would not give up. This is, in miniature, the paradox of the Drukhari's entire existence. Everything they have built, everything they are, everything they value and take pride in and would defend with their lives, grew out of conditions of terror and necessity that they would not have chosen. The civilization in all its dark magnificence is simultaneously real and authentic in every detail, and also the product of having been trapped in an impossible situation for 10,000 years and having made the best of it with extraordinary creativity and skill. Both things are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. Section 8. The disjunction, when the walls came down. In the closing years of what the Imperium calls the 41st Millennium, Commorragh experienced its most catastrophic crisis since its founding. The event known as the Night of Revelations and the Great Disjunction that followed represents something unique in the 10,000-year history of the Dark City. The moment when the deepest fear of the Drukhari was not averted or deferred or managed into an acceptable level of background dread, but actually arrived. The nightmare came home, whilst the cause was Yvraine, an Eldari who had walked nearly every path her species offered before ending up as a gladiatrix in Commorragh's arenas. In the great Crucible arena, she died in combat. And at the moment of her death, the Eldari god of the dead, Ynnari, who had been slowly accumulating power from the deaths of Eldari across 10 millennia, reached out with a sliver of his awakening consciousness and chose her as his prophet and high priestess. She was resurrected, transformed, infused with the deathly energies of a partially awakened divine being. The burst of divine warp energy involved in a god making direct contact with real space, inside the webway, in the heart of Commorragh, was precisely the kind of massive metaphysical event that the Drukhari had spent 10,000 years preventing from ever occurring within their city. The moment of Yvraine's apotheosis created a hyperspatial quake, a shockwave of metaphysical energy that propagated outward through Commorragh's carefully maintained dimensional architecture, like a hammer through glass. Cain's Gate, the ancient sealed portal that had been pressing back against demonic incursion since before the city's modern form, gave way. The seals failed. The door came open, and what was on the other side came through. Picture what this meant on a ground level. Through the now open gate poured the servants of Slaanesh, the entities that had been pressing against those barriers for 10,000 years, that had the most personal and passionate interest in the souls waiting on the other side. They spread through the districts adjacent to the gate like floodwater finding every available channel, consuming everything they encountered, and Commorragh's military response, though swift and experienced, was dealing with a catastrophe rather than a managed threat. Entire sub-realms were lost, walled off from the rest of the city as the demonic infestation spread beyond containment. Those districts amputated from the city's functioning body to prevent the corruption from spreading further. The population of those lost sub-realms, the Drukhari who lived there, along with their vast populations of slaves and captives, were consumed or transformed or simply swept away in the rushing tide of the incursion. Astrobile Vect himself retreated to outposts and strongholds on the fringes of Commorragh's domain, reorganizing, gathering his resources, letting rivals absorb the worst of the incursion while he positioned himself for the counterattack. When he did move, it was with characteristic precision, calling in centuries' worth of carefully accumulated debts, rallying the Incubi warrior sect and multiple Cabal forces in a massive coordinated assault that drove back the demonic forces and stabilized the city's core. But the cost was extraordinary. Commorragh emerged from the disjunction measurably smaller and demonstrably weakened. Sections of the city that had existed for thousands of years were simply gone. The Great Disjunction proved something that the Drukhari had known intellectually for centuries, but had never been forced to confront experientially at this scale. Their city was not as safe as it seemed, that the barriers that separated them from the thing that most wanted them were real, but not absolute. The worst-case scenario that their entire civilization had been constructed to prevent was not, in fact, preventable forever. And in the current era, with the Great Rift tearing through the galaxy and warp influence at unprecedented levels across real space, the pressure on Commorragh's barriers has only increased. The walls between the Dark City and the outside are under more stress than they have been since the fall of the Eldari, and the Drukhari know it. But let us sit with the disjunction a little longer, because it deserves more than a summary. What the Night of Revelations demonstrated is something that goes beyond simple structural failure of a fortification. It illustrated the specific and irreducible vulnerability at the heart of Commorragh's design, which is that the city exists in the webway, at the intersection of dimensional boundaries that must be actively maintained, and that the metaphysical environment it inhabits is not passive. It is not stone and mortar that simply stays put if you build it carefully enough. It is a living, turbulent medium that can be disturbed by events happening thousands of light years away, by the birth of new psychic forces, by the deaths of gods, by choices made by individuals whose actions no architect could have anticipated. The Drukhari have spent 10,000 years patching the cracks in walls they cannot fully understand, and the disjunction was the moment one of those cracks became a rupture. Yeah, think about what life must have been like in the districts closest to Cain's Gate in the hours after the seals broke. Commorragh is not a city of innocence. Everyone living there participates, willingly or unwillingly, in a system that runs on suffering, and most of the willing participants are not unaccustomed to violence. But there is a vast difference between the organized, aestheticized violence that the Drukhari manage and curate, violence that is controlled and directed according to social hierarchies and political power, and the kind of chaos that erupts when something that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be impressed, cannot be made to feel anything at all, comes pouring through your city's walls. The Slaaneshi entities that came through Cain's Gate did not recognize Cabal affiliation, while they did not distinguish between a powerful Archon and the lowest wretch in the slave pits. They came for souls, and they found them, and the screaming that rose from those closest districts carried a different note than the usual orchestrated anguish that fills Commorragh's ambient soundscape. It carried the specific, unperformative terror of people who were experiencing the very worst thing that can happen to them. And the Drukhari, who survived and watched from safer distances, had to process the sight of that, had to absorb the knowledge that the demon tide was not distinguishing between people who had elaborate homunculus resurrection pacts and people who had nothing, had to recognize that Slaanesh's servants, when given open access to Commorragh, were not interested in the elegant hierarchy of pain that the city's culture had developed. They were simply consuming, messily, indiscriminately, without any appreciation for the craft involved. There is a particular horror in the Drukhari recognizing, in that moment, that they were not special to Slaanesh. They were prey. All the thousands of years of refinement, all the elaborate cultural apparatus of Commorragh, all the political complexity and artistic ambition and spiritual maneuvering that they had built into their existence as a way of making their half-life feel like something worth continuing. None of it meant anything to the entity consuming them. They were simply Eldari souls, accumulated sustenance, property, and the indifference of that consumption was, in its own way, more terrifying than any amount of directed malice would have been. Vect's counterattack, when it came, was efficient and ultimately successful in the narrow technical sense of driving the demonic forces back and restabilizing the city's core. But it required him to spend political capital he had been accumulating for centuries. the favors and obligations and carefully cultivated loyalties that form the real currency of his power. These are finite, even for him. Calling them in all at once, in a crisis he had not anticipated and could not have orchestrated, was not something he could simply reverse afterward by accumulating more. The disjunction made Vect mortal in a way that 10,000 years of careful management had prevented, exposing him to the fact of contingency, that the galaxy could produce events capable of briefly exceeding his control, and that brief moments of uncontrolled exposure were sufficient to cost him dearly. What has changed permanently in the post-disjunction city is the texture of daily fear. Before, the horror of Slaaneish's interest was abstract for most Drukhari. They knew it was there, experienced it as the thirst, felt it in the slow drain of their soul essence over time. But the active, kinetic horror of demonic incursion was something the city's defenses had always handled at the level of institutional infrastructure. You did not need to personally encounter a Slaaneishi daemon in your daily existence in Commorragh if the seals held. Now, everyone in the city knows the seals can fail, where everyone has either witnessed the incursion directly, heard the specific quality of the screaming that came from the lost districts, or processed the knowledge that sections of their city, portions of the space they had considered absolutely safe, simply no longer exist. The background hum of existential anxiety that has always been present in Commorragh has been raised, permanently, to a higher frequency, and no amount of spectacle or stimulation or careful political management from Vect's direction has entirely brought it back down. Section 8. The Tyranids, the one prey that terrifies the hunters. There is a dark irony at the center of the Drukhari's relationship with the Tyranid hive fleets, one that the Drukhari would refuse to acknowledge openly while being perfectly aware of internally. The creatures who have made the entire galaxy their hunting ground have encountered something they cannot meaningfully eat. And the implications of that encounter are, in their specific way, one of the most practical existential threats the Drukhari face. The most immediately practical concern is what the Tyranids do to the warp in their vicinity. As a hive fleet approaches, the collective psychic weight of the hive mind generates a disruption field known as the shadow in the warp, a crushing, smothering presence that interferes with warp-based communication and navigation, that silences psychers and makes the Imperium turbulent and unreliable across the affected region. Craftworld farseers lose the ability to see clearly into futures. Imperial astropaths go dark. The shadow is not subtle. And it is not only felt by those who use the warp actively, it is felt as a physical sensation of wrongness by those psychically sensitive enough to detect it. For the Drukhari, while their lack of psychic presence makes the shadow less immediately personal, the disruption to webway navigation in heavily Tyranid-affected regions creates practical complications for their operations. Intelligence-gathering operations that rely on reading the psychic signature of populated worlds become degraded. The specific advantage of striking from unexpected vectors, hitting targets before they can warn each other, can be compromised. These are operational inconveniences rather than existential threats by themselves. But the deeper problem is something else entirely. The deeper problem is biomass and what the Tyranids do to it. The Drukhari's survival depends on a continuous supply of sentient beings capable of experiencing and expressing the specific kind of suffering that feeds the thirst. This requires individuality, consciousness, the specific psychic resonance of self-aware pain. The Tyranids consume all biological material they encounter, yes, but they also dissolve individuality. Absorbed organisms lose their self-awareness and become part of the hive mind's collective biomass, their individual psychic presence obliterated, their capacity for the kind of distinct, personal suffering the Drukhari need rendered inaccessible. A world being consumed by a hive fleet is a world whose population is being converted from potential prey for the Drukhari into something the Drukhari cannot use at all. And unlike most forms of catastrophe that deplete a raiding ground, wars that end, diseases that pass, disasters that allow populations to eventually recover, tyranid consumption is permanent. They strip everything. They leave nothing. They do not merely kill a world's population. They render the world itself unable to support organic life for centuries. The resource is not diminished. It is destroyed. On the scale of the hive fleet incursions occurring in the 41st millennium and beyond, fleets attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously, consuming entire sectors, threatening to reduce whole arms of the galaxy to stripped stone, the tyranids represent a direct and accelerating reduction in the total pool of sentient beings from which the Drukhari draw their sustenance. Every world consumed is a world the Drukhari cannot raid. And every species absorbed into the hive mind is a species that can no longer provide the specific quality of individual anguish they need. The existential math of this situation, calculated across enough time and enough hive fleet activity, leads to a place where the Drukhari simply run out of food. The War of Dark Revelations, in which the homunculus Urian Rakarth deployed his prophets of flesh coven alongside Tau forces to fight against a tendril of hive fleet kraken, reveals exactly how the Drukhari think about this problem. Rakarth was not helping the Tau out of anything resembling benevolence or alliance. The Tau Empire, in his assessment, was a valuable and irreplaceable source of potential victims, and allowing the tyranids to consume it would permanently remove it from the Drukhari's available hunting grounds. Yet he protected the Tau Empire as a resource, and his subsequent demand for a tithe of Tau subjects, including 7 ethereals, was the invoice for that resource protection. The tyranids also disturbed the Drukhari in a more philosophical dimension that is worth considering, even if the Drukhari themselves would not articulate it in these terms. The hive mind is a consciousness without individual desire, without the specific quality of self-aware experience that makes other beings interesting and useful to the Drukhari. It is an engine of consumption that recognizes no values, entertains no pleasures, makes no distinctions between the profound and the banal. It cannot be frightened in any way that produces meaningful sustenance. It cannot be made to despair, it cannot be tormented, not really. Because the specific ingredient that makes torment nourishing to the Drukhari, individual consciousness confronting its own destruction, does not exist in the tyranid form in the way they need it to. They are, in the most fundamental sense available to the Drukhari, bad prey. In a universe full of things that can be savored and suffered and found wanting or satisfying, the tyranids are a null. A machine that converts everything that has value into biomass, with nothing of value remaining. And the prospect of a galaxy gradually consumed until only the hive mind remains is one of the few truly existential threats to the Drukhari way of life that is not already embedded in the nature of what they are. Everything else they fear is internal or historical or personal. The tyranids are simply and terrifyingly external. An ending is if they run long enough, with no drama and no meaning attached. But let us press further into this, because the tyranid situation reveals something about the Drukhari that is easy to miss if you are only thinking about practical resource concerns. The existence of the tyrannid hive fleets holds up a kind of awful mirror for the Drukhari, and the reflection is one they are extremely poorly positioned to look at directly. Consider what the hive mind actually is, stripped of all external description. It is a collective intelligence that exists to consume. It has no culture, no individual desire, no internal political landscape, no philosophy or art, or any of the things that make an entity interesting to itself or to others. It processes the galaxy as raw material, identifies organic matter, consumes it, incorporates useful genetic information into its biomass, and moves on. There is nothing in the hive mind's operation that corresponds to a preference for one experience over another. There is no aesthetic. There is no pride of craft. There is nothing that could be called curiosity or wonder or grief or joy. It is consumption in its most fundamental and stripped-down form, a process that continues indefinitely, limited only by the available supply of what it eats. Now, the Drukhari, if they were honest with themselves in ways they are very careful never to be, would have to acknowledge that their own civilization shares a structural resemblance to this. They consume. The entire social and economic machinery of Commorragh is built around the continuous intake of suffering, the systematic harvest of pain and anguish from an inexhaustible supply of victims, processed and distributed as the spiritual sustenance that keeps them alive and the cultural currency that defines their social hierarchy. They are not the hive mind. They are more complex, more individual, more specific in their preferences, and more elaborate in their methods. But the fundamental operation, consume to survive, continue consuming to continue surviving, treat the universe's other beings as a resource, is not entirely different in its essential character. The tyranids represent a version of the Drukhari reduced to pure function, stripped of everything except the consuming itself. And looking at something that represents a simplified and honest version of your own foundational behavior is not something that most cultures handle well. The Drukhari handle it by not looking, by focusing entirely on the practical resource threat the hive fleets represent, while carefully not following the philosophical parallel to wherever it might lead. But the parallel is there, and the people within Commorragh who are old enough and observant enough and honest enough with themselves to notice it, the most ancient homunculi perhaps, who have been watching their civilization for long enough to see its deepest patterns, are in possession of a very uncomfortable piece of self-knowledge. There is also the matter of what the tyranids represent in terms of scale. The largest hive fleets to reach the Milky Way are not skirmishing forces. They are galaxy-changing events. Hive fleet Kraken alone, before its eventual defeat, had consumed dozens of worlds, and its component tendrils had penetrated deep into the galaxy's core regions. Hive fleet Leviathan attacked from below the galactic plane in a way that bypassed most established early warning systems. Hive fleet Behemoth struck at Ultramar in a campaign that cost the Ultramarines catastrophically. And these are the hive fleets that have been encountered and documented. The broader tyranid presence, the full extent of whatever lies beyond the rim, the size and composition of what has yet to arrive, is not known with any certainty. What is known is that what has arrived so far represents the forward edge of something considerably larger. For the Drukhari, operating on a timescale of personal centuries and civilizational millennia, the tyranid question is not abstract or distant. It is a slow encroachment that will not reverse itself, will not be satisfied, will not be negotiated with, and will not be impressed by any amount of cruelty or political sophistication. It will eat or be killed, and the portion of the galaxy it has already consumed will not recover in any time frame meaningful to a civilization operating at Commorragh's scale. Each hive fleet that arrives narrows the available resource base. Each world consumed is permanently removed from the equation, and the rate of that consumption is not decreasing. This is the fear that neither cruelty nor cunning can resolve. The Drukhari can outmaneuver their rivals, overwhelm their prey. He outlasts their enemies through the simple fact of their extended lives and their willingness to make every sacrifice that staying alive requires. But they cannot make the tyranids feel fear. They cannot harvest sustaining anguish from a hive organism that has no individual consciousness to suffer. And they cannot stop the slow erosion of the resource base that is the only thing standing between their civilization and spiritual extinction. Against the hive fleets, all of Commorragh's elaborate machinery of predation is simply beside the point. Section 9. The Ynnari, fear of hope, fear of change, fear of the truth about themselves. If the tyranids represent a fear from outside, an extinction-level threat to the Drukhari's supply chain, then the Ynnari represent something considerably more unsettling. They represent a fear from inside, a challenge not to the Drukhari's ability to survive, but to the entire narrative that justifies how they survive, and what they tell themselves about why they are the way they are. The Ynnari are a faction of Eldari drawn from multiple kindreds. Craftworld Eldari, Drukhari, Harlequins, Corsairs, who have gathered around the prophet Ivrain and the partially awakened will of Ynnari, the Eldari god of the dead. Their central belief is that Ynnari can be fully awakened without requiring the sacrifice of all remaining Eldari souls, and that this awakening would give the Eldari people the power to finally confront and potentially neutralize Slaanesh. To break the cycle, to end the debt, to find, if not full freedom, then at least the possibility of something genuinely other than what they have been trapped in for 10,000 years. For the craft world Eldari, this is a source of cautious hope and philosophical complexity. For the Drukhari, it is something considerably more threatening than any military enemy could be. Consider what the Ynnari's central premise actually implies for the Drukhari. Their entire civilization, from its founding to the present moment, has been built on a single foundational claim, that the situation is as it is, because there is no other way. That the raids, the slavery, the torture, the refinement of suffering into an industrial process are all necessary because the alternative is the thirst consuming them and Slaanesh claiming their souls. The necessity is the justification. The imperative is biological, it is spiritual, it is inscribed in the very nature of what they are, and no amount of repentance or reform can change the fundamental parameters of their existence. They are doing what they must. They are what they are because they have no choice. If Ynnari could be awakened, if the Slaanesh problem could be actually addressed, rather than merely and temporarily deferred, if there were genuinely another way, then the necessity collapses, and everything built on it collapses with it. The raids are not necessary, they are preferred. The torture is not required, it is enjoyed. The entire elaborate machinery of Commorragh's pain economy, all the political structures and social hierarchies and cultural aesthetics that are built around the justification of necessity, are exposed for what they actually are, not the inevitable consequences of an unavoidable situation, but choices made by the Drukhari. Again and again for 10,000 years. Choices they could, in principle, make differently. This is what Asdrubal Vect actually fears about the Ynnari. Not Yvraine as a military figure, though the chaos she inadvertently unleashed on his city certainly qualifies as a military concern. Not the Ynnari forces as an army, though they are capable enough on the battlefield. What Vect fears is the idea, the specific idea that the necessity justifying the Drukhari way of life is not in fact necessary. That idea, if it spreads within Commorragh, if enough Drukhari begin to genuinely entertain it, has the potential to dissolve the social foundations of the city in ways that no external force has ever managed to do. The civil unrest that has plagued Commorragh since the Night of Revelations is the various factions within the city that have been drawn toward the Ynnari's message despite Vect's best efforts to suppress it, demonstrates that this fear is not unfounded. When some Drukhari began hearing the whispers of Ynnari, a god of death reaching out to beings who fear death in the most personal and intimate way imaginable, some of them listened. Some of them defected. Some of them chose, in the quiet of whatever passes for privacy in Commorragh, to believe that another way might be possible. And Vect's response to these defections has been to engineer civil war without appearing to do so, manipulating cabals into attacking each other along the lines of pro-Ynnari and anti-Ynnari sentiment, now ensuring that the violence of Commorragh's internal politics is directed by his invisible hand toward eliminating Ynnari influence while preserving his own plausible deniability. Among the Ynnari are Drukhari, who have left Commorragh entirely, who have exchanged the specific intensity of existence within the Dark City for something they consider preferable. These individuals are walking proof that the choice can be made differently. Their existence is a persistent, embodied demonstration that the Drukhari are not locked into their current way of being by anything more inescapable than their own choices and fears. And for a culture built on the premise that they have no choice, these defectors are profoundly destabilizing simply by existing. The theological dimension of the Ynnari threat also deserves attention here, and because it operates at a depth that most purely political threats cannot reach. Ynnari is a god constructed from the accumulated deaths of the Eldari. Every Eldari who has died since the fall has contributed something to the slowly forming consciousness of this being. In a real and specific sense, Ynnari represents the spiritual weight of everything the Eldari have lost, gathered and concentrated into a divine force. The Ynnari's belief is that this force, fully awakened, would be powerful enough to confront Slaanesh on equal or superior terms. To contest the claim Slaanesh holds over Eldari souls, potentially to release that claim entirely. For the Drukhari, who have spent 10,000 years maintaining their existence precisely because the alternative is surrender to Slaanesh's hunger, this theology hits with the specific force of something that sounds like rescue. It is the thing they have been told and have told themselves does not exist. The idea that the debt does not have to be carried indefinitely, that the bargain does not have to be eternal, that there is something other than the cycle of raid and feed and diminish and raid again until the soul is finally consumed. And this is exactly why Vect treats the Ynnari not as a military threat to be defeated, but as an ideological infection to be quarantined. Military threats are familiar. The Drukhari have been fighting military threats for 10,000 years, and they are extraordinarily good at it. Ideological infections are different. They spread through exactly the mechanisms that Vect has always used to maintain his power, through whispered conversations, through individual reassessment of fundamental assumptions, through the quiet moments of private thought that even the most constant surveillance cannot fully reach. He cannot simply order his people not to believe something that sounds like salvation. He has to make sure they never hear it clearly, never consider it seriously, never sit with it long enough to do the honest accounting of what accepting it would mean. His method has been to muddy the waters, to ensure that the civil violence surrounding the Ynnari question in Commorragh is sufficiently chaotic and sufficiently personal that the ideological content gets lost in the noise of immediate political survival. When people are too busy calculating which cabal is currently aligned with which faction, and whether their current patron is about to change allegiances, and what that would mean for their own safety, they do not have the mental space to think carefully about gods and the nature of spiritual debt and what they are actually afraid of at the deepest level. The chaos is a screen. The confusion is intentional. And Vect maintains it with the same precision and the same patience that he applies to everything else about which he has a considered opinion. But the Ynnari endure. Yvraine lives. The Cronesords, artifacts of Yniad's power that Yvraine and her companions have pursued across the galaxy, are being gathered. The god of death is growing in his accumulated strength with every Eldari death. And the deaths in this era of galaxy-scale war are providing more accumulation than any previous period since the fall. Whether the Ynnari's hope is ultimately justified, whether Yniad will prove powerful enough to confront Slaanesh when fully awakened, whether the path they are walking leads somewhere other than a new catastrophe, none of this is certain. But the hope itself is real, and hope is the thing that Vect and the entire apparatus of Commorragh have always had the most difficulty containing. Section 10. The deepest fear, what has already been lost. We have covered the named, categorized fears. Slaanesh, the thirst, the psychic prohibition. Vect, the disjunction, the tyranids, the Ynnari. All of these are real, documented, law-confirmed fears that operate at various levels of the Drukhari experience. But there is one more fear beneath all of them, quieter and more diffuse, not articulated in the same explicit way, but present in the very texture of what the Drukhari have become. It is the fear that corresponds to a loss rather than a threat, the fear of what they have already become and what they have already lost in becoming it. The ancient Eldari Empire produced beings of extraordinary depth. Their capacity for love and grief and genuine wonder at the universe, for spiritual connections that went beyond mere sensation into something actually transcendent. for art and philosophy, and the kind of self-knowledge that could look honestly at what they were and make choices about what they wanted to be. All of this was real. The Eldari at their best were not just more intense versions of other sentient beings, but they were something qualitatively different. The Drukhari are the descendants of those beings. They carry the biological and neurological heritage of that depth within them. The capacity for it is still there, structurally, in every Drukhari alive. But 10,000 years of a very specific set of choices, reinforced by a culture that actively and deliberately rewards only the narrowest and most predatory range of emotional and intellectual expression, has made that access progressively more difficult and more rare. What the Drukhari have instead of depth is intensity, sensation in place of meaning, cruelty in place of creativity, or rather, cruelty as a form of creativity, the artistry of suffering substituting for the artistry of beauty and truth. And the full emotional and philosophical spectrum that the ancient Eldari possessed, the loves and griefs and genuine spiritual connections, the curiosity and wonder, the willingness to be changed by experience rather than simply consuming it. These have not been cultivated in Commorragh. They have not been valued. They have been, in the most literal sense possible, selected against in a culture that rewards the demonstration of power and punishes the display of vulnerability. The Homunculi, those ancient beings who have had millennia to think about what they are, sometimes give small indications of awareness that something has been lost. Their endless quest for increasingly baroque and novel forms of suffering and transformation is not simply cruelty for its own sake, though it is certainly that. It is also, yet in a way they might not be able to articulate, a searching, an attempt to find something intense and novel enough to fill a void they cannot clearly name, but can feel as a persistent, low-level wrongness at the center of their very long existences. They have experienced everything that Commorragh offers, and found that nothing easily touches them anymore, and the response to this diminishment is always to push further, to find something more extreme, as if quantity can substitute for the quality of experience they have lost access to. And then there are the soul-eaten, beings from whom Slanesh's slow, constant drain has taken so much, over so long, that whatever made them a particular individual has been consumed away. They wander Commorragh's streets as hollow shells. Is the biological habits of their former lives intact? They walk familiar routes, visit familiar places, perform familiar gestures, while whatever filled those habits, whatever looked out through those eyes, is gone, not dead, consumed. And unlike the quick death of a body destroyed in battle, this kind of ending does not trigger resurrection services, because there is no soul essence left to reconstruct. Every Drukhari who passes one of these wandering husks can see in it the image of their own potential future. The logical endpoint of a long life spent in the cycle of feeding, a life that extends indefinitely, not through growth or development, but through the constant theft of what others have and the constant loss of what they had themselves. There is no peace in this future, yet there is no wisdom or acceptance or any of the things that long life is supposed to bring. There is only a progressively increasing emptiness, and at the end of it, the final and total consumption by the thing that has been nibbling at them all along. This is the fear that cannot be named directly, because naming it would require the Drukhari to confront the value of what they have lost. And acknowledging the value of what they have lost would require them to acknowledge the cost of the choices they have made. Commorragh's entire cultural apparatus is designed to prevent this acknowledgement from becoming clear enough to act on. The sensory overload of the city, the constant violence and spectacle and stimulation, the social pressure to project confidence and cruelty, at the genuine physical demands of the thirst. All of these things keep the question from ever being asked loudly enough to demand an answer. But the fear is there. Underneath every act of cruelty, underneath every raid and every screaming arena and every torturer's precise attention to their work, underneath the accumulated centuries of skilled and enthusiastic monstrousness, there is a very quiet awareness that something has been lost that cannot be replaced. And the inability to directly look at that awareness, to name it and grieve it and make different choices in response to it, is perhaps the most complete and the most permanent of all the things the Drukhari are afraid of. Let us be more specific about what this lost depth actually felt like when it was present. Well, because the abstract claim that the ancient Eldari were profound in ways the Drukhari are not deserves to be given concrete texture. The ancient Eldari experienced love as a thing so complex and so layered that it contained within itself the capacity for genuine grief when what was loved was lost, not as a weakness or a vulnerability to be exploited, but as a measure of the depth of the original connection, something to be honored rather than hidden. They experienced wonder as an authentic response to encountering the unknown, an opening of the self towards something larger rather than a closing of the self in preparation to consume it. Their art was not merely skilled, but transformative in the specific sense of art that attempts to communicate something true about experience rather than merely to impress, to display power, or to demonstrate mastery over materials that cannot resist being shaped. In Commorragh, art exists. The Drukhari are genuinely creative in ways that many outside observers fail to recognize because the content is so difficult to engage with. They compose music of extraordinary technical sophistication, harmonics that use frequencies specifically selected to generate neurological responses, rhythms that play against the body's own involuntary pulse, arrangements built to extract maximum emotional impact with surgical precision. They create visual work of real aesthetic power, using materials that most civilizations would not think of as artistic media: the architecture of pain, the sculpture of living tissue, the carefully curated aesthetic of spaces designed to maximize specific psychological effects in those inhabiting them. Because the craft is real, the skill is genuine. But the soul behind it, in the specific sense of the artistic impulse that seeks truth rather than effect, that wants to communicate something to other beings rather than to overwhelm them, has narrowed enormously. What Commorragh's art does extraordinarily well is intensity. What it almost never achieves is depth in the sense of resonance that lasts, that changes the person experiencing it in ways they carry forward, that says something true about what it means to be alive in the universe. The ancient Eldari, at their creative peak, were producing things that had both. The Drukhari have kept the intensity and lost the depth, and they have lost the ability to clearly perceive the difference, because the cultural vocabulary for naming depth has been allowed to atrophy alongside the capacity for it. And the most poignant expression of this loss, perhaps, is in the domain of their social bonds, or rather, what has replaced them. The Drukhari form alliances, maintain cabals, build complex webs of mutual obligation and dependency. But genuine trust, the specific thing that makes alliance something more than a temporarily aligned set of calculated interests, is extraordinarily rare in Commorragh. Everyone knows that everyone is betraying or planning to betray everyone else. The social contract is explicitly and openly a contract of mutual predation, held together not by loyalty, but by the mutual assurance that betrayal is costly. This is functional. Commorragh has operated on this basis for 10,000 years, and the fact of its ongoing survival demonstrates that it works in the practical sense. But the ancient Eldari knew friendship, a real, costly, chosen friendship. Relationships in which one being's well-being genuinely mattered to another, not because of political calculation or fear of consequence, but because of something that resisted reduction to simple utility. They knew parental love so intense that it reshaped the lover more than the loved. They knew the kind of spiritual connection between individuals whose depth of soul allowed them to genuinely see each other in ways that most species can barely imagine. All of this has not been selected against in Commorragh because it was undesirable in any simple sense. It has been selected against Because in a society where showing that something matters to you provides your rivals with a tool to use against you, the survival optimal response is to not let things matter. To cultivate the appearance of connections without their substance. To treat affection as a performance and loyalty as a calculated position rather than an actual state of the self. The cost of this optimization accumulates across centuries. A Drukhari who has spent 500 years deliberately not allowing anything to matter to them is not someone who could simply decide to allow connection if they chose to. The capacity itself has been damaged. And a Drukhari who has spent 500 years consuming the emotional anguish of others as sustenance, drinking in the specific pain of loss and grief and terror, is not someone who is well positioned to suddenly access their own capacity for those states as anything other than a mechanism of their spiritual nutrition. The categories have been collapsed. Yet the distinction between felt and consumed has been eroded, and there is no clear path back from that erosion that does not require first honestly acknowledging how complete it has been. The soul-eaten are the extreme end of this process. But the process itself is universal, and the degree of attenuation varies only by duration and individual circumstance, rather than by any fundamental difference in what is happening. Every Drukhari who has lived long in Commorragh is somewhere on the spectrum between the vibrant, deep-souled beings their ancestors were and the hollow wanderers of the underspires. The question is only of degree and of speed, and the particular horror of this for the Drukhari is that the very things that slow the process, the raids, the feeding, the cultivation of suffering in others, are themselves part of the process. But you slow your own erosion by consuming what fills the void, but the act of consuming changes you in ways that make the void larger and the self that remains less complete. It is a trap with no exit visible from inside it, and every Drukhari who lives long enough to notice this and is self-aware enough to recognize what they are noticing is carrying a grief they have no language for and no permissible way to express. Section 11. The whole picture. Why all these fears are one fear? Let us pull everything together, because the beauty and the tragedy of the Drukhari's fear architecture is specifically in how all the pieces connect, how each one feeds into the others, how the entire system is self-reinforcing in ways that make it almost impossible to escape from within. Before we do that synthesis, though, whilst there is one final layer worth naming, one that sits so close to the surface of everything we have already discussed that it could be missed by being too familiar, it is the fear of stopping, of stillness itself. The Drukhari cannot afford, in the most literal spiritual sense, to stop moving. The thirst requires continuous feeding. The soul erosion that would accelerate dramatically in the absence of the sustaining energy they draw from others' suffering means that inactivity is itself a form of dying. But beyond the strictly spiritual necessity, the frantic pace of Commorragh's life, the constant stimulation, the unceasing spectacle, the relentless social maneuvering, the raids and the politics and the arena games and the personal vendettas. All of this serves an additional function that no one in Commorragh would admit to openly. It keeps the silence away, because in the silence, the questions would become audible. In the stillness, the awareness would surface, the awareness of what has been lost, what is being slowly consumed, what the endpoint of this trajectory looks like. The Drukhari keep themselves and their city in a state of perpetual motion and noise and stimulation, not only because the thirst requires it, but because the psychological alternative would be a confrontation with themselves that their entire cultural apparatus is designed to prevent. The busyness is a defense, the cruelty is partly a distraction, and the elaborate social games that occupy every waking moment of every Drukhari in Commorragh are, at least partly, and a way of ensuring that no one is ever left alone with their thoughts for long enough to do the kind of honest accounting that might lead somewhere productive. This is perhaps the truest and most human thing about the Drukhari, this reaching for noise to drown out the voice that knows. It is not a behavior unique to ancient alien civilizations. It is recognizable in every being that has ever chosen stimulation over stillness, action over reflection, the familiar pain of their present condition, over the uncertain and terrifying possibility of facing what they actually think and feel and want. The Drukhari simply do it at a civilizational scale, and with a thoroughness and a duration that makes it one of the most complete examples of this pattern that the galaxy has produced. Slaanesh was created by the Eldari's excesses. The Drukhari were the most extreme of those Eldari. They bear the most direct spiritual debt to the monster they helped create. Their response to that debt is to continue and intensify the behavior that created it in the first place, feeding Slaanesh the suffering of others in lieu of their own souls, keeping the engine of pain running because it is the only engine they have. This continuous feeding produces exactly what Slaanesh wants, on a galactic scale, forever, which makes the Drukhari simultaneously the entity most threatened by the Dark Prince and the entity most useful to it. They are afraid of Slaanesh, and they are Slaanesh's instrument, at the same time, without contradiction. Their suppression of psychic power, born from fear of drawing Slaanesh's attention, what has made them something qualitatively different from what the Eldari were, narrower, less complete, operating with a significant part of their heritage deliberately sealed away and allowed to atrophy. This makes them safer from one specific threat, while being itself a form of the diminishment they fear most, a narrowing of what they are, a closing off of possibility, done in fear of something that is already consuming them anyway. The fear of the disjunction is the fear of the home becoming the threat. For 10,000 years, Commorragh has been the one place the Drukhari can call safe, the one location in an extraordinarily hostile universe where the rules are theirs and the exits are theirs, and the power structure, however brutal, operates according to patterns they understand and can navigate. The disjunction demonstrated that even this can fail, that there is no true refuge, that the dimensional architecture between them and their worst fear is maintained by effort rather than by nature, and that the effort can be overcome. When the people who have spent 10,000 years making the rest of the galaxy afraid of them were forced to run from something inside their own city, it changed the internal psychological landscape of Commorragh in ways that have not fully resolved. The confidence was already performance to some degree. It became more so after. Their dependence on the homunculi for resurrection puts them in permanent relationship with the oldest, most powerful, most untrustworthy beings in their civilization. Or the insurance policy against the one death they cannot afford comes with terms and conditions that are never fully disclosed and can be modified retroactively at the discretion of the insurer. The protection is real, but the thing providing it is itself a source of fear. Their fear of Vect is the clearest expression of Commorragh's fundamental and inescapable truth. In a society built on domination, there is always someone more dominant, and submission to that someone, however well disguised as respect or admiration or simple caution, is still submission. Even the most powerful and ancient Drukhari in the galaxy, short of Vect himself, operates within the shadow of his intellect and his patience, and his absolute willingness to make any cost acceptable in service of his goals. Their fear of the tyranids is a fear of their own eventual irrelevance in a galaxy that has been so thoroughly consumed that the resource sustaining them no longer exists. A fear of a universe without prey, which for the Drukhari is a universe without survival. Their fear of the Ynnari is a fear of self-knowledge, of the implications that would follow if they honestly examined what they are and acknowledged that what they are is, at least in significant part, what they have chosen to be. The Ynnari do not represent an enemy so much as a mirror, and the Drukhari are afraid of what they would see in it. And then there is the fear of their own architecture of paranoia, the daily life they have built that is itself a fear response, the hyper-alertness and the performances of strength and the inability to trust that were originally adaptations to impossible conditions and have now become who they are. The fear that what began as a response to being trapped has become indistinguishable from their genuine nature. The fear that if the trap was somehow removed, they would not know who they were without it. And underneath all of it, the quiet, chronic, unacknowledged fear of what they have already lost. of the beings they might have been if different choices had been made 10,000 years ago, of the depth and richness that the ancient Eldari possessed and the Drukhari have spent 10 millennia methodically abandoning. All of these fears are real. All of them are simultaneously accurate assessments of genuine threats and reflections of genuine losses. And all of them exist together, every day, hidden behind the masks of their terrible beauty and their enthusiastic cruelty, carried through the eternal twilight of Commorragh, for 10,000 years and counting into the darkness of whatever comes next. The Drukhari are, when you see them clearly, a civilization in mourning for something they would never admit to missing, living a life of frantic sensation, precisely because they cannot bear the silence that would come from stopping, raiding the galaxy for the spiritual sustenance that lets them keep running from the awareness of what they are and what has been done to them by their own nature and their own choices. In the grimdark far future, where there is only war, they are something specific and extraordinary. They are beings who have mastered the art of looking terrifying, who have made fear and pain into their aesthetic and their survival mechanism, who present to the galaxy the image of absolute confidence and absolute cruelty, and who are, underneath all of it, more afraid than almost anything else that walks among the stars. Closing, why this matters, and where we go from here. There is a reason the Drukhari endure as one of the most compelling factions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. And it is not simply because their aesthetic is extraordinary, though it genuinely is, or because they play in a uniquely satisfying way on the tabletop, though they certainly do that too. The reason they endure is that the story underneath the cruelty is rich in a way that most grimdark fiction struggles to achieve. Most villain factions in this kind of setting are powerful and destructive and threatening, yet they exist to be opposed or to serve as the permanent obstacle that makes heroism meaningful, or to embody some particular horror that the setting wants to explore. The Drukhari do all of these things, but they also do something rarer and more interesting. They are, in their specific way, tragic. Not sympathetic exactly. Their victims are real, and their enthusiasm for causing suffering is genuine, and nothing about their internal fear architecture excuses the harm they do. But tragic in the Greek sense. Beings of extraordinary capability and ancient heritage, brought low not by some external force they could not have avoided, but by choices made long ago, and choices made continuously since. By the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of deciding that the only way through was through, that the necessity justified everything, that the alternative was unthinkable, even when the alternative might not have been. Understanding what the Drukhari are afraid of does not make them sympathetic, but it makes them real in a way that simple villainy cannot achieve. It makes them a civilization rather than a monster, a people rather than a hazard, beings who experience something genuinely painful about their own existence, even as they work so hard to make sure every other being in their vicinity is experiencing something worse. They are afraid of death and cannot avoid it. Afraid of Slaanesh, but cannot resist serving the gods' hunger through everything they do. Afraid of what they have lost and cannot stop losing more of it. Afraid of what they have become and cannot become anything else without dismantling the only structure that has kept them together for 10,000 years. Afraid of hope itself, because hope would require honesty, and honesty would require reckoning with choices that cannot be undone. That is a lot for any civilization to carry, and they carry it every day behind the masks of their razor-edged beauty in the eternal twilight of the most terrifying city in the galaxy for 10,000 years and counting. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, and it is this. The Drukhari are not a fixed point. They are a civilization in motion, one that is, in the current era of the setting, under more pressure and in the presence of more genuinely novel forces than they have encountered since the fall itself. The Great Rift has changed the metaphysical environment in which they operate. The disjunction has changed the internal stability of Commorragh. The rise of the Ynnari has introduced, for the first time in 10,000 years, a serious and sustained challenge to the ideological foundations of their civilization from within the Eldari community itself. And Vect, for all his extraordinary intelligence and his 10 millennia of experience, has been shown to be something less than perfectly omniscient. What comes next for the Drukhari is not written. The lore at the current edge of the setting is genuinely uncertain about the trajectory of their story, and that uncertainty is itself interesting. The possibility that the Ynnari's hope is founded, that Ynnari could actually be awakened fully, that the eternal debt could be genuinely addressed rather than merely managed, is a possibility that the current setting takes seriously rather than dismissing. The possibility that the tyranids continue their advance at a pace that eventually makes the Drukhari's resource problem a genuine existential crisis is equally real. The possibility that the next event on the scale of the disjunction finds Commorragh less prepared or Vect less able to contain it is something that cannot be ruled out. The Drukhari have survived 10,000 years by being better at the terrible game of survival in this universe than almost anything else that plays it. But survival is not the same as victory, and the things they carry with them, the grief they cannot name, the debt they cannot discharge, at the slow erosion they cannot stop, these have been accumulating across the entire span of that survival. The city of Commorragh is, in a very real sense, both the Drukhari's greatest achievement and their longest-running prison sentence. And somewhere in its eternal screaming dark, behind every mask and every performance of absolute confidence, there is a civilization that knows this about itself and cannot find a way to stop it from being true. That is what the Dark Eldar are afraid of. Not any one thing, all of it, together, carrying it always, never being able to put it down. If this is the kind of deep lore exploration that speaks to you, if you want to understand not just what factions do in the 41st millennium, but what they carry with them, what they fear in the dark, what their cruelty costs them alongside what it costs their victims, then this is exactly the channel you are looking for. We do not skim surfaces here. We follow the threads down into the deep places where the most interesting things in 40K actually live. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. It genuinely helps the channel grow. It means this kind of long, careful, considered content keeps being possible. And it means you will never miss one of these deep dives when it drops. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see the Drukhari even slightly, or if it simply passed some time in a way that felt worthwhile. And if there is an aspect of Drukhari lore you want to explore further, or a completely different 40K faction you think deserves this kind of treatment, leave that in the comments. This is a community built around genuine curiosity and a real love of this setting, and every comment helps shape what comes next. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with us. We will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.